All right, Cherub, thank you for joining me once again. Today we're going to talk a bit about Nick Norwitz and his latest video, because why not? Why not indeed? Today I shall be mostly wearing this house coat, otherwise known as a dressing gown, depending where in the world you are. Yeah, why not is the reason. For those that are going, why is he wearing a house coat / dressing gown? Well, why not? Apparently it's just wear whatever crazy thing you like day around this house. Good morning. Anyway, welcome. Right, so this is the video I'm making about Nick this week. This is not the obvious video I probably should make about Nick this week. The one where I critique his video, wherein he said, here are a number of ways in which you can, for want of a better term, artificially lower your LDL, despite the fact that there is no indication that any person should do any such thing, health-wise. In fact, it seems to be contraindicated, if anything. And that a number of the items on his list of advices to folks who might want to lower their LDL cholesterol, even though they shouldn't, it seems, included things like add some fiber to your diet. Swap out saturated fat for poly and monounsaturates, said Nick. Or add some carbs to your diet. If you're a lean mass hyperresponder, so-called. Well, you can see what sort of a field day I could have with that video. I'm not going to. I'm going to do this video. This is a video where Nick is presenting some interesting studies from a new statin trial. And I just wanted to add some commentary because, well, I think it's needed. So, stick around. Here it comes.
I just read a brand new study about how statins impact energy production in muscles.
Shock me. A known metabolic, specifically mitochondrial toxin, HMG coenzyme A reductase inhibitors, causes an impact on muscle function. What a shock. Mechanism of action, the statin knocks down the ability to produce coenzyme Q10, it would seem. At least that's what was hypothesized. Here's a study that suggests something a bit different. Nonetheless, we're still not surprised, mainly because the first comment I want to make about Nick's reading of this paper or presentation of this paper to you, the viewer, is in the fact that I think he's got his order of operations all ass about face. Because when I pick up a paper to read it, the first question that I am going to scan that paper for an answer to is, what are the faults, flaws, foibles in this paper? What are its limitations? Nick's done that last a bit on this paper. No, Nick. First, we'll look at limitations first. That said, go on though.
It was actually handed to me by a concerned cardiologist, and it has me thinking differently about this class of medications. If you stick around, I'm going to go over all the data. And
no, you're not, Nicholas, going to go over all the data. Putting a few graphs up on the screen for a few seconds at a time is not going over the data, okay?
And wrap some context around it so you know what I'm saying.
You mean the context being your opinion on the data, rather than what the data necessarily actually does say, perhaps.
And what I'm not. Welcome to my channel. Stay curious.
A new study in the journal JCI Insights finds that high-dose statin therapy can actually harm mitochondrial function.
Well, as I said before, shock the hell out of me.
But wait, let's wrap some context around this a little bit and provide clarification up front. This video is not going to say statins are bad per se, nor deny that in certain patients they can reduce cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, but you're also not going to support that claim either, Nick, because there is no data extant which is capable of so doing. Risk is necessarily a cause and effect statement. It implies a mechanistic means by which the two factors must be able to interact in a causal fashion. No such data is extant in the peer-reviewed publication to this date, being the 14th of March, 2024. Cause and effect data by scientific definition, by scientific discipline, is experimental and controlled before the fact. Properly controlled before the fact. Ethics committees will not allow such experimentation on human beings, quite rightly so. Ergo, the claim of cause and effect, therefore risk, therefore hazard, or any such similar statement, null and void. There is no indication whatever of risk extant in the data. And Nick, if you want to debate the quality, veracity, and power of the data that is available in terms of the so-called prospective cohort studies and or the so-called Mendelian so-called randomization, Nick, on this topic, you'd be very welcome on my channel to have such a discussion about the strength, utility, and power of that pile of rubbish, frankly. Because there's nothing that convinces me of anything in there either, by way of even an inference. So, cause and effect, risk, hazard, no, absolutely not. An inference of the possibility of that, no, not really. Okay, so, not good, not good. Anyway, let's carry on.
While I understand that might be the opinion of some on the internet, it's not my opinion.
Yeah, but so what, Nick? Opinions are like anal orifices. Most everybody's got one, and it's probably full of shit.
However, I am very pro talking about potential benefits and drawbacks of any interventions.
Great. We would need some data that would be able to meaningfully inform us with utility to have such a discussion. That would be awesome, though.
In statins, while they have their benefits, also
No, they don't, Nicholas. There are no demonstrated benefits of statins. False.
have their drawbacks.
Same argument. No, there's no established, but it seems like there are some pretty big drawbacks. Like, just one crazy example, just off the cuff. How about an 11,800% increase in the incidence of ALS associated with the intake of statins, Nicholas? That would seem to be quite a large relative change in the risk of a universally fatal neurodegenerative disease. Interesting.
Let's consider the data for what they are.
Okay, let's see what sort of a job you do with that.
Data. With that, this new study sought to investigate a potential mechanism behind the high rates of muscle weakness, pain, and cramps, up to 30%, experienced by patients on statins.
Yes, it's hitherto been thought to be largely around coenzyme Q10, otherwise known as ubiquinol. However, this study proposes something slightly different, although not necessarily unconnected, of course. Anyway, carry on.
Subjects were just eight.
There you go. So before you start getting into how, valuable this study may or may not be, that's the first point, isn't it? N equals 8. So the statistical power of this thing is going to be probably pretty weak at best.
Overweight, sedentary adults.
Okay, so that's the next thing, isn't it? Right. Therefore, we have a subpopulation of people phenotypically described as being obese individuals in their mid-30s, I think it was. Let's get the numbers on that.
Mean body mass index 31.9.
Right, so obese people.
Kilograms per meter squared. Mean age 36 years. And
there you go. We didn't get much of a spread around either of those numbers given to us there, Nick. Why is that? Because the spread will probably be quite wide because N equals 8. Okay, so signal-to-noise ratio is going to be a really serious issue in this study before we even look at what the numbers that came out of it were.
About half, or exactly half male, half female.
For which, Nick?
And they were put on high dose.
Notice there was no third option there, by the way?
Dose atorvastatin of 80 milligrams for 8 weeks.
Right, so that's the next limitation of the study. This study talks about things that were observed in 8 obese individuals aged 36.2 plus or minus we don't know what over 8 weeks total. So we cannot extrapolate what would go on after 9, 10, 15 or 52 weeks a year, 10 years, or 50. This study can inform us on what happens in obese individuals aged 36.2 plus or minus something or other over 8 weeks. Good.
With measurements made throughout. Statin therapy decreased their LDL from 120 to 64.4 milligrams per deciliter.
Right, so that shows that this drug does what it is supposed to do in terms of its target, that is to knock down the ability to produce cholesterol, ergo leading to a lower level of cholesterol in the blood. So yes, it does that. We understand that it does that. There's no question of that. There never has been. Does it work? Yes. Is it safe and effective? Well, that's where the questions start coming in, like the ALS one I gave you just before. The very high rate of myopathies, basically, Nicholas. Whether it's caused by a lack of coenzyme Q10 or whether it's some other mechanism around complex 4, as we're about to get to, doesn't really make much difference, does it? It's quite significant, 30%. And obviously, the more exposure by way of exposure versus time, the longer you're on this stuff at a given dose, the more likely the myopathy would seem to be. Were those two things causally connected, which they seem to be. Speculation, I get that. But anyway, you'd have to show me benefit that would far outweigh the potential drawbacks, side effects, problems associated with that particular class of pharmacological intervention before I would even look at it. And no one's been able to do so. And as such, this is a contraindicated poison and nothing else because there is no benefit demonstrated.
Now, for the interesting data. To measure aerobic capacity in skeletal muscles in vivo in humans, the researchers used non-invasive near-infrared spectroscopy.
Interesting. The typical methodology is to physically collect gas and analyze that during rest and physical exertion challenge. So this is an advancement, perhaps, depending on its accuracy, which I would suspect would be not too bad. Sounds quite techy, doesn't it?
That's a big mumbo-jumbo. You don't really need to understand the exact terminology. The specifics aren't important, but...
Nick, that's the thing about science. False. The details really are important. That's where the devil is, in the details, Nicholas. No, it's a folly and a falsehood to suggest that, the details aren't important. Yes, they are. Okay?
Basically, they had participants contract muscles to increase the metabolism and oxygen consumption of those muscles, and then examine the recovery kinetics of the muscle, which is related to aerobic capacity of the muscle.
Related to, rather than this is actually a direct measurement of. Oh dear. So now we're measuring something by proxy, perhaps quite accurately, but we're dealing with a proxy which will have its own error inherent. Oh dear. It's not an advancement. I thought it wasn't going to be. That's why it's important. Nick, the details are important. Whoops.
The muscle. And as shown here, there was a significant decrease.
That should say muscle VO2 estimated, because it hasn't been measured by the methodology as you've just described it directly. You should also look at the error bars if you haven't already there, Nicholas, and notice several things. Number one, you have failed on this chart on the screen right now, Nicholas, to give us any indication of what those error bars refer to. Are they standard errors? Are they standard deviations? Or are they some other measurement? So, ergo, that gives us a limited capacity to suggest the likely meaning or power of this signal to any noise on the basis that you haven't given us what the noise was. Let's assume that those are standard errors, because that's the most likely, in which case you would need to multiply those out by the square root of n, which was 8, as an n was 8, so the square root of 8, and that would give you the true standard deviation spread, and then you'd have to put 1.96 of those above and below the data point to give us a range of 95% confidence around that data point. And then what you're going to see there is actually no difference in this situation or whatever. There is no power in these statistics. They are piss weak, Nicholas. Ergo, putting these pretty charts up on the screen without saying exactly what I've just said about the power and utility of these statistics is just wasting everybody's time and being sensationalist a bit. Okay, this is rubbish. There's nothing to see here. What's next?
And muscle oxidative capacity. Next, to assess the potential effects of statin therapy on skeletal muscle mitochondrial.
Yeah, potential effects, because there is no way to establish cause and effect here.
Function. Muscle biopsies were taken throughout the study and subjected to different protocols to test mitochondrial function along the electron transport chain.
Interesting. Painful if you're one of those subjects over the next, really several weeks recovery.
And all three protocols revealed similar outcomes.
Okay, good.
A progressive decline in maximal stimulated oxygen consumption.
Okay, so again, we can actually see the entire data set here. So the representative graphics superimposed over them is colourful and catches the eye, but it's actually redundant here. Look at the black dots. See how much overlap there is between the left hand and the right hand end? A great deal. Signal to noise ratio, statistical power of the data sets. There is nothing to see here either. The study is too small, Nick. N equals 8. That's why, probably. Okay?
Which in the graphs is represented as JO2 over the 56 days of atorvastatin treatment. This resulted in a 30 to 38% decrease.
Plus or minus what, Nicholas? That's the whole point. Signal-to-noise ratio indication is vital to us as scientists if we want to be able to judge the veracity and meaning of this finding. Unfortunately, you're not allowing us to do so if we can't actually see the data set for ourselves right now, which, unfortunately, Nick, we can. See? There it is. Goodness me. Look at the overlap there between the left hand and the right hand ends. It's really quite significant. Nothing much to see here.
And skeletal muscle mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation capacity, as you can see here in figures 2D through F. Interestingly, they found that of the mitochondrial complexes in the electron transport chain, which sits in the inner mitochondrial membrane and is responsible for efficient energy production, complex 4, the fourth of the main complexes, was exquisitely sensitive.
Exquisite is not a scientifically descriptive or empirically descriptive term, Nick. What you're looking at there is a highly statistically significant finding. In this case, because the magnitude of the effect swamps the noise on this a bit, or much better than the previous chart. But, so what? Here is a study suggesting that statins have a demonstrable effect on complex 4 activity. Great, that's a reason not to take statins, given that statins provide no demonstrated benefit in terms of health outcomes, longevity, health span, any of those things. None at all. Debate me on it, Nick. If you don't agree with me, come face me on the channel. We'll be nice to each other, because we're not actually, you're not a vegan supporter, so I'm not going to slag you off in that way. We can have a discussion about the statistics. It'll be awesome. People will love it. Great view numbers, probably. What's next?
Exhibiting a greater than 50% reduction in function at even nanomolar concentrations of atorvastatin, which can be reached in vivo based on the doses given to the patients. So
more guesswork, but okay, fair enough.
Those were the main findings, and I realized they're quite provocative.
Why? And to whom? Other than people who make statins and shouldn't do.
But I wanted to point out 2 more things. First, and importantly, none of the patients actually reported myalgias or other muscle-related symptoms throughout the study.
So what? It's an 8-week study. Get back to them after 8 years taking a metabolic poison such as a statin and see whether the incidence goes up by then.
Thus, this decline in mitochondrial function, this progressive
and probably ask more than 8 people.
Decline in mitochondrial function seen over 8 weeks isn't necessarily associated with muscle symptoms. food for thought.
It necessarily wasn't, Nick, in this case. That's a definite. That's an absolute established. 8 people, none of them had a problem on this study. Okay, you don't need to be equivocal about that statement. It's a fact. It's just that you didn't look at those people long enough, the people that did this study.
Second, although there was a trend towards a decreased whole body aerobic capacity, this trend was non-significant.
Right. It wasn't even statistically significant, let alone of clinical meaning or utility. Ergo, Nicholas, this whole discussion has been a waste of time.
But because the trial was only 8 patients, I suspect the trial was just underpowered in that...
It is. Look at the data set. It's underpowered. We can do the calculations if you really want to, Nick. But we don't really need to. We look at the data set and we say, look at the noise around that signal. We're done here. What's next?
Larger trials, there would be a significant drop. So basically, in statistics or in science, generally, a result is considered statistically significant if the p-value drops below 0.05.
True, but that says nothing whatever about clinical meaning or utility, whatever. It's purely a statistical statement, parsimoniously, around the likelihood that the finding that has been observed under control might have happened due to dumb chance. So we're saying we're pretty sure on this because it's less than 5% likely that that could have happened statistically based on this sample size and this effect size. But is that useful to anybody in any way? Well, that statistical definition cannot inform on that topic. So the answer to that has to be, well, so what?
And the p-value is influenced by the n-value.
Yes, absolutely.
Number of people in the trial. So because there were only 8 people, it's harder to hit below that p-value. But if you scaled the study up, the trend suggests that you might approach that threshold.
That also suggests that you might not too, Nick. That's the whole point of there being insufficient power to have confidence around what you've seen in these 8 people. No? Okay.
And that will be consistent with other trials that actually have shown decreased aerobic capacity in patients on statins versus patients not on statins.
Okay, so what a shock.
Now, on to the limitations of the study.
Right, so this should have been first.
This was a small-scale exploratory study without a control group.
Right. So this is a naturalistic observation based on a very small number of people subjected to an intervention for a short period of time, producing incredibly noisy output statistics, which really are not particularly worth convincing us of anything other than more work is required, which is what the whole point of this study was, to suggest that and to justify a funding application for a large-scale study. What we should be reporting on, Nick, is the large-scale study when that's done so that we have some actual useful information on which to base an assertion. Okay, so is this maybe the mechanism or not? Okay? No? All right.
Granted, I think it would be hard to placebo this rather objective outcome in mitochondrial function, which makes me think the data are robust.
Yeah, but they're not robust because they are insufficient in volume. N equals 8 for a very short period of time, ergo very noisy, not very signally.
And,
And also applicable only to folks of that age, plus or minus whatever the spread was on this group, and who are obese with a BMI around 31, because this does not translate to other populations either.
Should be taken for what they are. But this was not a double-blinded, large-scale RCT.
Right. So why are we talking about it, Nick? Why don't we just ignore this until there's some actual useful data?
The authors call out that needs to be the next step.
Exactly. That's the whole point of doing this study, Nick, is so that they can justify the funding application for the study. This is a pilot study, right?
Thus, what we need next is a larger scale study to follow on this one, ideally with a placebo and double blinding to confirm the findings. But personally, I have no reason to think that these results wouldn't be replicated.
You do, though, Nicholas, look at the spread of the data. It suggests to you that there is a high likelihood that this data is inaccurate as a descriptor of what we would likely find in a population, a large population of people who are all that age, that fatness, etc., the likelihood that the actual true value in the population falls somewhere other than what we found in this study is very high. In fact, that's the point. Okay?
Larger scale, double-blinded RCT. And finally, I do want to reemphasize, this study isn't saying statins are bad per se, but it's shining a light on a new mechanism.
It's not really new. It's just, well, you said new mechanism, and it's not that. It's a new hypothesis based on an observation made in 8 people for a short period.
May mediate some of their drawbacks, which do exist, while also highlighting that the longer-term side effects that can occur with statin use might not be picked up in shorter-term studies.
What a shock.
This actually then becomes a very complicated inquiry, as epidemiology doesn't really show convincing data that statins increase, say, dementia rates.
Right, but it does show pretty convincing data that the rate of ALS is 11,800% increased. Up to. That's pretty convincing.
I don't think that the data currently support that claim, although it remains a possibility, because such data are complicated by the fact that populations assessed are typically metabolically unhealthy, and statins have pleiotropic or many effects.
Right.
Thus, it doesn't necessarily follow that treating a young, healthy person with lifelong statin therapy, a lean mass hyperresponder perhaps, couldn't manifest in more prominent long-term consequences that haven't yet been detected in.
The same is true in any population of human beings whose respiration requires adequate functioning of their mitochondria throughout the lifespan. Everybody, Nick. Okay? We know, absolutely without question, that statins do have an effect on the production of coenzyme Q10. We know that. That is enough. Because there are no demonstrated benefits of statins, that is a reason to say they are contraindicated. A mechanistic reason to say this is not doing us any good here. All right? Very, very straightforward to understand, I would have thought.
In large cohort data sets. Of course, this is clear speculation, and I want to highlight that. But we will see what the coming data say. For now, I just wanted to share these data for your open-minded consideration.
Right. And the response is, Nick, I think we could tidy up in terms of how we present what's happening in the literature this week to be clearer about the universally disgraceful standard of the pustulous excremental garbage being produced at large in the field of health science regarding human beings. That's just my opinion. Doesn't have to be yours. Anyway, there it is. Sum up.
That's all.
All right. Good sum up. All right. There it is. Nicholas Norwitz, who's been naughty and nibbling nuts. Have a look at his video where he's talking about ways you can reduce your LDL, even though there's no need to, and you shouldn't, probably, it seems. Nicky Norwitz's Nut Nibbling Company or something, whatever it was called. Good stuff. All right. See you next time when someone will be wrong on interwebs, because it doesn't look like slowing down anytime soon, does it? No. See you later.